What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Immortal X-Men, specifically the full-on return of Apocalypse, which technically he's been back since the last video that we made, but we get to see him in all his glory. So this is the portion of Fall of X that focuses on the 250,000 mutants that were whisked away to some unknown location. Now, a lot of you guys said you thought it was the other dimensional realm of Araco. Those of you guys who are familiar with everything that's been happening in the X-Men since Jonathan Hickman's original run, that's not where they're at. And in fact, they're in a really, really cool location. But what we know is that within this kind of desert realm that they've been in, they have essentially been attacked by different versions of Wolverine. These almost kind of feral versions of Wolverine, which we thought were like the clones of Wolverine from the Wolverine solo series, when Beast was making like, you know, clones of Wolverine and then attacking humanity and that kind of thing. If you're not familiar with that, it's not overly important. What does matter here is that during this time, after this initial reprieve with these pot shots that are constantly being taken, right? These different versions of Wolverine just seemingly keep coming after them, that what we end up doing is picking up with the resurrection of one of these mutants, a member of the Five, using a resurrection egg. Now, the resurrection egg is the way in which mutants basically bring themselves back from the dead. These things were thought to have been completely and totally destroyed during the fall of Krakoa, but there is one with enough to bring a single mutant back. And what this does is it completes the Five. In essence, what it does is it allows any of the X-Men here to basically be resurrected. The only caveat is they need an egg to do it. So if they don't have an egg, there's no real way to bring them back. But what this does establish is that resurrection is still an option on the table once everything returns to a state of normalcy. But the person who was able to pull this off was Mother Righteous, who's basically a clone of the villain Mr. Sinister, albeit a female version and one that delves in magic. She does have mutant abilities, but she's also very duplicitous, right? She always has an ulterior motive. There's always something else going on. So even when you have Destiny, right, the woman who can see the future, right, even when she looks at Mother Righteous, she's like, I don't fully trust her. Now, before people who are unfamiliar with the X-Men ask, if she can see the future, wouldn't she know whether or not Mother Righteous is going to betray them? That's a fair question. But as we've talked about so much in the X-Men comics, the accuracy of Destiny's predictions become less and less, right? They become less and less accurate the further out she looks. So even if Mother Righteous is going to betray them all, there's no guarantee that it's going to happen. But even beyond that, right, the entire group is led by Exodus. And while Exodus is an astronomically powerful telepath and telekinetic, he sees himself as the kind of person leading the mutant population right now. In his mind, there's no room for doubters. So even when Destiny comes along and says, right, like, I don't know if I fully trust her, the response of Exodus is enough, right? Like, she's useful. She's returned the Five to us. She has returned immortality to us. Is it professional jealousy? Her visions are true. You have none. What use are you now? So it's one of those things where he kind of approaches it from the perspective of saying, like, you're just pissed off, right? You're just jelly because she can see the future and you can't, right? Like, it's kind of interesting. But the reality here is that Destiny is not somebody that you dismiss. Even if her power isn't what it used to be, or even if it's not there at all, if she has a gut feeling, you usually go with it, right? She's the kind of person within the X-Men universe whose predictions or viewpoints are kind of beyond contestation. So it almost sort of gives this idea that Exodus is not really thinking clearly or rationally. And there's a reason for that, because what they're told by Mother Righteous is that there is another vision she had, right? Somebody else, another lost mutant out in the woods, not the literal woods, but just out there in this place that they're at. And so what you end up getting is Exodus along with Hope Summers that basically travel to try to find this mutant. Now, this is where things get cool. At this point, you switch over to Charles Xavier. Now, as we talked about in the previous X-Men comics and in the Immortal X-Men comic itself, Xavier is staying on the island of Krakoa, trying to protect it from anybody out there that would try to plunder its riches or disrespect it in any capacity or anything like that. And so what ended up happening is Sebastian Shaw, who was at one point a member of the governing body of the X-Men, but is now one of the people trying to plunder this place, keeps sending soldiers in, but they keep getting massacred. right? And the response here is that we thought it was Charles Xavier, but his power is telepathy, not telekinesis. And so while he can cast illusions to trick people into thinking they're seeing gigantic monsters, there was no real tangible or reasonable explanation for why these soldiers' bodies were found torn to pieces. And so what you end up getting is a combination of Sebastian Shaw donning a kind of Iron Man-esque armor for himself, as well as Selene launching an attack against Xavier. Now, as we talked about before, of course, Selene, she's a really old mutant. She basically feeds off the life energies of other people in order to keep herself alive, but she's very capable and she's very powerful. But when they launch their attack against Xavier, it's more than he can cope with on his own. So telepathically, he reaches out to Emma Frost, who's doing her whole thing in the Iron Man comics. And once the two of them start talking, she asks the question, what is it that Sebastian Shaw wants? And that's when she telepathically shows him Sebastian Shaw was kicked out of the Hellfire Club, right? And that while Wilson Fisk Kingpin had taken his place, Sebastian Shaw is trying to find a way to get back in. And so using that information, Professor Xavier telepathically contacts Sebastian Shaw and says, look, here's the deal. I've harvested passwords for a dozen key Hellfire accounts. You can use them to start to take back control. It'll be a battle, but this is enough of a win if you act now. Go recover your club. Krakoa will still be here when you're done, right? So it's kind of a way to sort of create a bit of a ceasefire there. And so Sebastian Shaw, realizing this opportunity, fires on Selene and then says, well, you know, he took over my mind. There's nothing I could do, right? Which is enough to knock Selene out in the moment, kind of put her out of capacity. And then in turn, you have him who takes Selene, he leaves, and then he basically uses the information Xavier gave him to go after the Hellfire Club. Here's the kicker to it all. He makes this kind of offhanded remark, right? He says, like, I understand it's a deal. God, Xavier, I hate to think what we've unleashed. You were always a manipulative guy, but murderous you is something else. I think even Selene squirmed when she saw the bodies. And the response of Xavier is, I don't understand what you're talking about. I haven't killed anybody, which begs the question, who was killing the soldiers on the island? So what this does here is it switches back over to Hope Summers and to Exodus, as well as Jean Grey, right? Jean Grey is technically dead and nobody really knows where these guys are right now. But what ends up happening here is that Hope Summers goes to read the mind of Jean because Jean is just kind of like going on and babbling on about nonsense, right? Like, but he couldn't survive the Phoenix, not him, not even Scott, my distant, passionate Scott. In my reality, I steered the shuttle, I called for help, I let the Phoenix have me. That's not when I went wrong, right? And this is kind of her being delirious and sort of struggling. This is actually all playing out in the Jean Grey solo comic by Louise Simonson. It's really, really cool, but it's also really slow. So I'm not 100% sure if I'm gonna cover it or not. But in this moment, you have Hope who asks the question, we're missing something. This is where we're supposed to be. What are we missing? That's when Apocalypse shows back up. And he says, like, you're Satan, and he attacks Exodus. Now, the reason why he refers to himself as his Satan and the reason why he looks the way he does is because this is how he originally appeared to Exodus. So for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the character of Exodus in Marvel Comics, this guy fought during the Crusades. That's how old he is. He's been around for hundreds of years, but originally he was just a guy named Bennett. But what ended up happening is that in a pursuit of a quote unquote greater destiny, word had reached his ears of a person out there in Egypt that could grant him the destiny he was looking for. And when he got there, he was met by Apocalypse. Apocalypse unleashed or kind of woke up his telepathic and telekinetic abilities, and then ultimately Exodus turned against Apocalypse. Apocalypse overpowered him and then locked him away. A few hundred years later, he was released. He initially started off as a villain and then he became a good guy, but he sees Apocalypse as the worst thing to ever happen to him. He despises and he hates Apocalypse much in the same way Sinister does. And so as they're talking, Apocalypse keeps making these statements, right? He says, prideful, grandiosity was always on your list of sins. I am who you say I am. Here, that is true. We are in your desert, right? The desert that Exodus always thought of whenever it was he was thinking about his time with Apocalypse. What this means is this location that they're in it's malleable. It's not a finite place. They're not out in the Sahara. They're not out in Morocco. They're in a location which changes and adjusts based on the thought process of the person in it, and specifically what seems to be the most dominant person in it. And so where the questions asked by Hope, like, what is this guy on about? Exodus responds, I know not. I had visions of this place long ago, and he is right. I think of him as my Satan. But what you end up having is Hope Summers that comes to this realization. Logan, she sees Logan as Logan killed her. She sees Bishop as Bishop hunted her. And now Apocalypse, Exodus's Satan, is in Exodus's desert, right? And that's what Apocalypse is like, revelation awaits, girl, are you ready? And so what she does is she scans the mind of Jean Grey, and while there is a kind of telepathic feedback, she responds in saying, I'm okay, but Jean Grey's not. Her mind is on fire, it's burning, so hot, beyond hot. So I know where we are. I don't know what it means, but I know. And she asked the question, what's the white hot room? They're in the white hot room, son. And I don't know what it is, man, but Marvel has hardcore been focusing on the white hot room, right? Where the white phoenix of the crown resides. If ever there were a time where Jean Grey would go back to the height of her power, this would be it. Because when Jean Grey was the white phoenix of the crown, she was powerful than pretty much any and all cosmic entities out there. I would argue she was more powerful than the Living Tribunal. We never actually saw them fight, and I don't think there's really any indication that she definitively was. But outside of like any illusions that were created, right, Here Comes Tomorrow, that she exists to quote unquote fix universes, things like that she can meddle with, she can eradicate whole universes if she wants to. With that level of power, yeah, man, I would say that she's probably a little bit above, if not equal to, the Living Tribunal. If she attains that level of power here, if she realizes who she is, and the Phoenix remerges with her in the white hot room, she's gonna turn into God with a quickness. And so what we end up doing is jumping back to Professor Xavier, the mystery that so many of you guys have been chomping at the bit for, right? There's this kind of monologue that we get, which is really more kind of Apocalypse musing to himself with everything that was going on out in the white hot room, but sort of applies here where he says, no one survives revelation. The person you were is dead and gone forever. In their place, perhaps someone stronger, perhaps no one at all. In the end, there is only revelation itself, and revelation cannot be denied. In essence, Professor Xavier is seemingly the one who's been killing the soldiers on the island, but he's infected with the Sinister gene, meaning he's becoming an evil version of himself, and most likely, he's developed a more advanced version of telekinesis because he does have it. It's just very, very subtle. It seems like it's become a lot more powerful, right? The plot thickens. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up on Follow X, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.